Today we're going to look at a brief introduction to the fairy tale genre. There are a few big topics I want to discuss, and those are the origins of fairy tales, adaptation theory, and general characteristics of the fairy tale genre. So the first thing to look at, naturally, is where fairy tales come from. To quote Maria Tatar in a different introduction than the one you're going to read, fairy tales are not unique one-offs, and their narrators are neither original, nor godlike, nor inspired. To the contrary, these stories circulate in multiple versions, reconfigured by each telling to form kaleidoscopic variations with distinctly different effects. When we say the word Cinderella, we are referring not to one single text, but to an entire array of stories. Although many variant forms of a tale can now be found between the covers of books and are attributed to individual authors, editors, or compilers, they derive largely from collective efforts. So think of it this way. Asking who wrote Cinderella, or any other fairy tale, is like asking who invented meatballs. Well, no one did. Lots of people in lots of different places developed something similar, but with different local flavors. What fairy tale types share in common is a basic plot structure. The term tale type is used by folklorists, and one tool used is a tale type index developed by Auntie Arne and refined by Smith Thompson. The Arne-Thompson Tale Type Index categorizes stories into tale types based on their plot structure. So, for example, a story is labeled a Beauty and the Beast tale type if it has this structure: the monster as husband, disenchantment of the monster, loss of the husband, recovery of the husband. It's not that a bunch of separate people heard one version of Beauty and the Beast and decided to copy it with their own spin. Instead, lots of people from all over the world told different stories with that general sequence of events, and folklorists many years later decided to call them all Beauty and the Beast stories. So initially, these stories all circulated orally. They were told as a form of entertainment among working class people, probably changing subtly from telling to telling. They weren't really told with children in mind. In fact, they usually contained plenty of raunchy humor to keep listeners amused while they went about their work. As time went on, those stories began to be appropriated by the higher classes, especially in 18th century France, where they were told in literary salons, which were kind of like little cafes where people would exchange stories and entertain one another. Around that time is when a few men thought the tales should be preserved, and they began the task of collecting them. Charles Perrault and the Brothers Grimm are two of the most significant collectors of these tales, but their work didn't come without some problems. The defining characteristic of the fairy tale had, up until that point, been its changeability. It differed with every retelling and had been a form of expression for the frustrated and exploited lower classes. So when educated men decided to write them down, a few things happened. 1. The stories lost their changeability, and particular versions became standardized. 2. Much of the humor and expression of the lower classes was edited out for the sensibilities of the wealthy. And 3, the versions written down were marketed as children's stories, so morals were added where there hadn't been any before because people believed that children ought to learn lessons from stories. And those literary fairy tales have become the most frequently adapted versions because that's what we have access to now. All of the oral tales have basically disappeared. So it's important to note that not all fairy tales got their starts this way. Hans Christian Andersen and Oscar Wilde, both writing in the 19th century, wrote original fairy tales that did not stem from oral tales. Andersen is the author responsible for The Little Mermaid, The Ugly Duckling, The Princess and the Pea, The Emperor's New Clothes, The Snow Queen, The Frog Prince, and many other stories now regarded as classics. Oscar Wilde wrote primarily for adult audiences, but he also contributed The Selfish Giant and The Happy Prince to the fairy tale canon. Regardless of their origins, fairy tales are constantly subject to adaptation, drawing on the tradition of oral storytellers. Just like a story changed with every telling when it was told among the working classes in the fields, fairy tales are still subject to adaptation with every retelling. So what is an adaptation? An adaptation is anything based on another text, cultural phenomenon, song, play, or other cultural product. In terms of fairy tales, Walt Disney's Cinderella, for example, is an adaptation. So are all the rest of Disney's fairy tale films and all the fairy tale films and TV shows by other studios. The stage musical Into the Woods is an adaptation, and the film is an adaptation of the stage musical. Any storybook you see with a fairy tale title or fairy tale characters is also an adaptation. What's important to know about adaptations is that they all make changes, and those changes matter, especially when we use them as ways to understand the cultures they're developed in. In order to understand those changes, though, we have to know the story that a text is being adapted from. We're looking at Cinderella this week, so I won't use that as an example since I want you to do that brain work in your journals. Instead, I'll talk about Snow White. So the Disney film is adapted from the version written by the Grimm brothers. And in the Grimm brothers' story, after hearing the magic mirror tell her that her stepdaughter is more beautiful than she, the queen asks for 7-year-old Snow White's lungs and liver to be boiled in brine so she can consume them. The huntsman tasked with killing Snow White pities her, and instead brings the queen a boar's innards on a plate, telling Snow White to run away. Snow White finds a small cottage belonging to 7 dwarves and takes shelter with them. The queen discovers that Snow White is still alive when the mirror continues to announce that Snow White is the fairest of all, and the queen makes 3 separate assassination attempts against little Snow White. The first time, the queen disguises herself as a peddler woman selling stay laces or corset strings, and she ties them so tightly that Snow White can no longer breathe. However, Snow White is revived when the dwarves discover her and untie her stay laces. The second time, the queen again disguises herself and sells Snow White a poisoned comb, which causes her to fall down dead when she uses it to comb her hair. And when the dwarves return home and pull it out of her hair, she comes back to life. And the third time, the disguised queen sells Snow White a poisoned apple, and the dwarves this time cannot revive her. They place her in a glass coffin on top of a mountain so they can continue to look at her beautiful face. And one day, a prince sees her and asks the dwarves if he can keep the coffin and its contents, because Snow White, who yes is still 7, is just too beautiful to live without. And the dwarves give the coffin and the corpse to the prince, and while his servants are hauling it away, the poison apple lodged in Snow White's throat is jarred, and she is restored to life. The prince says, "I love you more than anything else on earth. Come with me to my father's castle. You shall be my bride," and they get married. They invite the wicked queen to the wedding and make her wear iron slippers heated over coals, forcing her to dance in them until she dies. The end. Ooh, okay. So if you're familiar with the Walt Disney adaptation of that story, you might have noticed some differences. Here are a few that I found. First, Snow White seems much older than 7 in the Disney adaptation. Second, the dwarves in the Disney adaptation have names and personalities. Third, nobody threatens to eat Snow White's organs. Fourth, the queen only uses the poison apple to kill Snow White in the Disney adaptation. 5, Snow White is revived by the magic of true love's kiss, not by bad science. 6, Snow White meets the prince at the beginning of the Disney adaptation, making him seem slightly less like a pedonecrophiliac at the end. 7th, the queen falls off a cliff while trying to kill the dwarves in the Disney adaptation. Nobody makes her wear hot iron shoes. And 8th, the film has a lot of fluttery singing in it. So these changes matter. They tell us something about American culture in the 1930s when the film was made. For instance, audiences might get squeamish about a queen attempting to cannibalize a 7-year-old, or about a prince deciding to keep her dead body like a piece of art. Audiences want to be entertained by cute dwarves with a storyline. Audiences would rather be enchanted by a magical ending, and might not believe that simply removing a piece of poison apple would revive a victim. Audiences are more comfortable with the accidental death of a villain than with a villain's torture and eventual death of third-degree burns and exhaustion at a wedding. And people like a specific type of music. Those are all changes specific to the Disney adaptation, and they make it a specifically American adaptation of the Snow White tale type. Okay, so there's also a few characteristics that tend to permeate the fairy tale genre. Those include a very general time and location, so we often hear once upon a time in a land far away. Doesn't really tell you when or where. We also see lots of things that happen in threes, 3 tasks, 3 wishes, 3 friends, whatever else. We see someone in the story rising up from a lower class position to an upper class position, and that's a direct reflection of the story's origins in the lower class. We also see magic solving problems. We see clear protagonists and clear antagonists, kind of a good versus evil thing going on. And we often see a happily ever after ending. You'll find a lot of these things in fairy tales and in fantasy stories more generally, since fairy tales are direct ancestors of fantasy. In fact, you can look for some of those things in Harry Potter next week. You'll find almost all of them. So that's it for today. I hope this has been helpful for you as you work through the readings this week. And as always, feel free to get in touch with me with any questions. I'm looking forward to reading your thoughts.